The moment Paul crashed John's studio, even producers couldn't believe it. The air in London always carried a certain weight, a blend of history and unspoken secrets. But on this particular day, in a secluded studio, that weight was amplified, thick with the ghosts of a fractured brotherhood. John Lennon, a man forged in the fires of fame and disillusionment, stood on the precipice of a new sound. A raw, unvarnished truth he was desperate to unleash. Yet a shadow lingered, a melody unfinished, a chord unresolved. And then the door creaked open, and the past walked in uninvited, carrying a guitar and a lifetime of shared, complicated history. This wasn't just a visit. It was an intrusion, a collision of worlds that threatened to shatter everything. The London air, perpetually damp and heavy, pressed against the windows of Ascot Sound Studios. Inside, the atmosphere was a different kind of thick, dense with cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and the electric hum of a recording console. John Lennon, a man whose very presence seemed to warp the space around him, hunched over a grand piano, his fingers hovering over the keys like restless spirits. He was chasing a sound, a phantom melody that promised to unlock a new, brutal honesty in his music. The year was 1971, and the world still reeled from the seismic shockwaves of the Beatles' demise. For John, the rupture was more than just a band breaking up. It was a limb torn away, leaving a phantom ache that no amount of primal scream therapy could fully soothe. He was deep into the sessions for Imagine, an album that would become a cornerstone of his solo legacy. Yet at this moment, it felt like a battlefield. Each note was a struggle, each lyric a confession. The studio, once a sanctuary, now felt like a confessional booth, demanding absolute truth. The engineers, accustomed to John's mercurial moods, moved with a quiet deference, their eyes darting between the control panel and the intense figure at the piano. They knew the history, the whispers, the unwritten chapters of a story that had captivated the globe. They knew the name that still hung in the air, an unspoken counterpoint to John's every move. Paul. John slammed a chord, a dissonant clang that reverberated through the room. "No," he muttered, shaking his head, his spectacles glinting under the harsh studio lights. "It's not right. It's too polite." He craved rawness, a visceral scream that would tear through the polite veneer of pop music, a sound that would reflect the turmoil within him. The ghost of a shared past, of harmonies woven so intricately they seemed to breathe, was a constant, unwelcome guest in his creative space. He was trying to exercise it, to carve out a new identity, yet every chord, every phrase seemed to echo with the memory of another's voice, another's touch on the fretboard. The studio, a fortress of his own making, felt increasingly vulnerable, a stage set for an inevitable, dramatic confrontation. The air crackled, not just with electricity, but with an unspoken tension, a premonition of something monumental about to unfold. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon, a man perpetually caught between the public's adoration and his own internal chaos, had retreated to Tittenhurst Park, his sprawling estate in Ascot, Berkshire. It was a grand, almost regal setting. Yet for John, it was less a palace and more a gilded cage, a place where he could attempt to reconstruct himself away from the relentless glare of the world. The studio, a converted space within the estate, was his current battleground. Here, amidst the state-of-the-art equipment and the lingering scent of old wood and new ambition, he sought to distill his essence, to strip away the layers of expectation and myth. His days were a blur of intense creative bursts and brooding introspection. Yoko Ono, his constant companion and muse, moved through this world with an ethereal grace, a silent anchor in his storm. She understood the depths of his pain, the lacerations left by the band's dissolution, the public's insatiable hunger for a reunion that would never come. John, in turn, found solace in her unwavering presence, a shield against the ghosts that haunted his waking hours. The studio itself was a reflection of his current state, meticulously organized, yet with an underlying current of raw, unbridled energy. Guitars leaned against amplifiers, their strings vibrating with unspoken melodies. Lyric sheets, scrawled with urgent, often confrontational words, lay scattered across music stands. He was working on How Do You Sleep, a track that would become infamous for its scathing lyrical attack, a venomous outpouring aimed directly at his former songwriting partner. The words were a weapon, honed by years of simmering resentment, of perceived slights and unbridgeable distances. He would spend hours, sometimes days, meticulously crafting these lyrical barbs, each one a shard of glass aimed at a phantom target. The producers and engineers, seasoned veterans of the music industry, watched with a mixture of awe and unease. They recognized the genius, the raw, undeniable talent, but they also sensed the profound hurt that fueled this creative fire. John was not just writing songs, he was writing his own narrative, attempting to rewrite a history that had become too painful to bear. He was the architect of his own solitude, building walls of sound and words around himself, convinced that only through this isolation could he truly find his voice. But even in this carefully constructed fortress, the foundations were shaky, susceptible to the tremors of an uninvited past. The afternoon light, thin and watery, filtered through the studio windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the mixing board. John was hunched over a tape machine, listening to a playback of a new track, his brow furrowed in concentration. The song was a visceral outpouring, a raw nerve exposed, and he was dissecting every nuance, every tremor of his own voice. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the lingering ghost of his last cigarette. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the outer office. Muffled voices, a sharp, insistent tone, then the unmistakable sound of a door being pushed open with more force than politeness allowed. John froze, his hand still on the tape machine. His eyes, usually guarded, narrowed with a flicker of recognition, a premonition of disruption. Then he appeared. Paul McCartney. He stood framed in the doorway, a figure both familiar and utterly alien in this space. His presence was a shockwave, a sudden, jarring chord in John's carefully constructed symphony of solitude. Paul was dressed casually, a leather jacket slung over his arm, his expression a complex mix of defiance, hurt, and an almost desperate hope. He wasn't alone. A small entourage, including Linda McCartney, hovered nervously behind him, their faces reflecting the palpable tension. The studio went silent. The engineers, who had been quietly working, suddenly found themselves caught in the crossfire of a historical moment. They exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering over controls, unsure whether to continue or simply disappear. John slowly straightened up, his posture stiff, his gaze unwavering. There was no warmth, no greeting, only a stark, almost predatory assessment. "What do you want, Paul?" John's voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of years of unspoken grievances. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. Paul stepped further into the room, his eyes sweeping over the equipment, the scattered lyric sheets, finally settling on John. "I heard you were in here," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. though a tremor betrayed the underlying strain. "Heard you were busy." His gaze flickered to a lyric sheet on a stand, a half-finished verse of "How Do You Sleep?" clearly visible. A flicker of pain, quickly masked by anger, crossed his face. The air crackled. This wasn't a friendly visit, not a casual drop-in. This was an invasion, a direct confrontation. The unspoken truth, the hidden wound that had festered between them for years, had finally been exposed, raw and bleeding, in the sterile confines of John's private sanctuary. The producers, who had witnessed countless studio dramas, could only watch, stunned, as the two titans of music stood poised on the brink of an explosion. The secret was out. The fragile piece John had built was about to be shattered by the very man he had tried so desperately to erase from his narrative. The silence that followed Paul's arrival was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with unspoken accusations and years of shared, then fractured, history. John's eyes, usually shielded by his glasses, were now direct, piercing. "Busy," he echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Yes, busy trying to make music that isn't saccharine." The barb was sharp, aimed directly at Paul's perceived softer musical direction. Paul flinched, a subtle tightening around his jaw. "And I suppose writing songs about me is part of that raw honesty?" He gestured vaguely towards the lyric sheets, the venomous words of "How do you sleep?" hanging in the air like poison. "You really think that's what people want to hear, John? More bitterness?" "People want truth, Paul," John retorted, stepping away from the tape machine, moving closer, closing the distance between them like a predator stalking its prey. "Not pretty lies wrapped in a bow, not songs about fluffy clouds and silly love songs when the world is burning." His voice rose, gaining momentum, fueled by a deep-seated resentment. "You think I don't know what you're doing? Trying to paint me as the madman, the one who broke it all up, while you play the innocent victim." Linda McCartney, who had remained silent, now stepped forward slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for Paul's arm. "John, please," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't helping anyone." John's gaze flickered to her, a cold dismissal in his eyes. "Stay out of it, Linda. This is between us." Paul gently pushed her hand away, his own anger now rising to meet John's. "No, John. This is about everyone. It's about what we built, what we destroyed. You talk about truth, but you're rewriting history to suit your own narrative. You forget the hours, the days, the years we poured into it. You forget the brotherhood." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, a raw edge of pain cutting through his anger. "Brotherhood?" John scoffed, a cynical sneer twisting his lips. "Is that what you call it? Or was it just a convenient arrangement until you decided you wanted to be the sole king of the castle?" He paced now, a restless energy radiating from him. "You think I didn't see it? The subtle manipulations, the quiet undermining. You always wanted control, Paul. Always." The accusations hung heavy, each word a blow. The producers and engineers, frozen in their positions, felt like unwitting witnesses to a private, brutal autopsy of a legendary partnership. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was the unraveling of a legacy, a public tearing apart of the fabric that had once bound them. The tension was unbearable, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on everyone in the room. Each man, wounded and defensive, was desperate to assert his own version of the truth, to claim ownership of a narrative that had become too complex, too painful to share. The conflict was escalating, threatening to consume not just their present, but the very memory of their past. The air in the studio was thick with the residue of their words, each accusation a splinter embedded deep. John and Paul stood facing each other, not as former bandmates, but as gladiators in an arena of their own making, battling for the soul of a shared history. The engineers, now fully aware they were witnessing something profoundly intimate and destructive, had instinctively powered down most of the recording equipment, leaving only the ambient hum of the studio lights. No one dared to capture this. "You talk about control, John," Paul finally said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier bravado, revealing a raw vulnerability. "But you were the one who always had to be the rebel, the iconoclast, the one who had to burn it all down to prove he was free." His eyes, usually bright and optimistic, were now clouded with a deep, weary sadness. "Did you ever stop to think about what you were burning? What we all lost?" John flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. The accusation, delivered with such quiet pain, seemed to pierce through his defenses. "Lost?" he spat, but the venom was less potent now, tinged with something akin to despair. "What did I lose, Paul? My sanity? My identity? Or was it just the illusion of a perfect partnership that was suffocating me?" He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his posture slumping slightly. "You always saw the bright side, didn't you? The endless summer? But there was a winter, Paul. A long, cold winter that you refused to acknowledge. And you refused to see the spring," Paul countered, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "The possibility of growth, of evolution, without destruction. We could have found a way, John. We could have." He took a hesitant step forward, his hand half raised, as if to bridge the chasm between them. "All those years, all that music, did it mean nothing to you?" The question hung in the air, a fragile, desperate plea. John's gaze dropped, his eyes fixed on the polished floor, seeing not the reflection of the studio lights, but perhaps the ghosts of Abbey Road, of Hamburg, of 1,000 shared moments. The anger, the bitterness, seemed to drain from him, replaced by a profound weariness. He saw not just Paul, but the young man he had once known, the eager, talented kid who had completed his musical sentences, who had understood the unspoken language of his soul. For a long, agonizing moment, the two men stood in a tableau of shattered dreams. The air was thick with the weight of what was lost, what could never be regained. It was the climax of their personal drama, not with a shout, but with a whimper. A quiet, devastating acknowledgement of the irreparable damage. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden embrace, only the stark, brutal truth of two men, once inseparable, now irrevocably separated by the very legacy they had forged together. It was an unspoken requiem for a friendship, a partnership, and a dream that had once captivated the world. The darkest moment wasn't an explosion, but this quiet, crushing realization of what had truly died between them. The confrontation, or rather, the quiet implosion, left an indelible mark on the Ascot studio. Paul, after that final poignant exchange, had turned and walked out, his entourage following in a hushed procession. He left behind not a trail of anger, but a lingering scent of melancholy, a ghost of what might have been. John remained, standing in the center of the room, utterly still, as if the very act of movement would shatter the fragile peace that had descended. The engineers, sensing the profound shift, slowly began to power up the equipment again, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. They understood that something fundamental had changed. The air, once charged with hostility, now carried a different kind of energy, a raw, exposed vulnerability. John eventually sank onto the piano bench, his fingers idly tracing the keys. The venom that had fueled "How Do You Sleep" seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He looked at the lyric sheets, the cutting words now seeming hollow, devoid of their intended power. The act of tearing down had left him feeling not triumphant, but utterly drained. In the days and weeks that followed, a subtle but significant transformation began to unfold in John's creative process. The sharp edges of his anger softened, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more nuanced, more reflective. He still sought truth, but perhaps with a greater understanding of its complexities, its inherent pain. The music he produced for Imagine still carried a raw honesty, but it was tempered by a deeper introspection, a more universal yearning for peace, both internal and external. He began to work on songs like Jealous Guy and Oh My Love, tracks that explored themes of regret, vulnerability, and the intricate dance of human connection. The studio, once a battleground, slowly became a sanctuary again, a place where he can explore the scars of his past, not just with anger, but with a growing sense of acceptance. The encounter with Paul had forced him to confront not just his former partner, but himself. It had peeled back layers of defensiveness, revealing the raw, aching heart beneath. The challenge of human relationships, the resilience required to navigate profound loss, and the difficult decisions that shape one's path, these elements became more pronounced in his work. He was still John Lennon, the rebel, the provocateur, but now there was a new depth, a weary wisdom etched into his artistic soul. The studio, once a place of conflict, became a crucible for transformation, forging a new sound, a new voice, from the ashes of a shattered legacy. The final tracks for Imagine were laid down in a quiet, almost somber atmosphere. The album, a testament to John's raw talent and his journey through personal turmoil, was complete. Yet the echoes of that day, the uninvited chord of Paul's presence, lingered in the studio, a subtle resonance in every note. John, though outwardly composed, carried the weight of the encounter, a new kind of silence within him. The album was released to critical acclaim, a powerful statement from a man who refused to be defined by his past, yet was undeniably shaped by it. How Do You Sleep became a controversial anthem, its biting lyrics a stark reminder of the deep rift between the two former friends. But for John, the song had taken on a different meaning. It was no longer just an attack. It was a testament to a pain so profound it demanded expression, a scream into the void of a lost brotherhood. Years passed. The world moved on, but the legend of the Beatles and the complex, often painful relationship between its primary songwriters only grew. John continued to create, to evolve, to challenge. He found moments of profound peace, of domestic bliss. But the shadow of that studio confrontation, the raw vulnerability it exposed, remained a part of his artistic DNA. The studio in Ascot, now silent, held its secrets close. The mixing board, the piano, the very walls seemed to absorb the history, the arguments, the unspoken truths. It was a place where a legend had wrestled with his demons, where a friendship had been irrevocably altered, and where the raw human cost of fame and ambition had been laid bare. John Lennon, the man who sought to dismantle myths, ultimately became one himself. His music, his life, his very being became an intricate tapestry woven with threads of love, anger, peace, and conflict. The encounter with Paul in that London studio was not the end, but a crucial turning point, a moment that forced him to confront the deepest wounds of his past and to forge a new path, however solitary. And as the final notes of his life faded, the question lingered, a whisper carried on the wind. In the grand, unfinished symphony of John Lennon's existence, was that uninvited chord a dissonance? Or was it, in its own brutal way, the most honest note of all? A truth, perhaps, too painful to fully comprehend, yet essential to the melody of his untold legacy.